Devil's Crush quickly became one of my favorite games back when I first played it as a wee lad on my original Grafx, and honestly, it still is, despite me not really being that into pinball generally. I mean, it's okay, I guess. I did play the hell out of this thing. But with Devil's Crush, the demonic medieval aesthetic full of satanic imagery and witchcraft, the densely packed playboard with multiple levels and gorgeous bonus stages that kept things interesting, and of course, the music. Good God, the music. This tune from the main board is still, after all these years, one of the best tunes ever made for a video game in my opinion. It almost makes you forget that there are other outstanding tracks for each bonus stage. But somehow, I totally missed that there was an alternate version of the game released on the Sega Genesis by Tengen. Once I eventually got into collecting as an adult, I ended up finding out about it, and I rather like this version a lot too. But this isn't going to be a comprehensive review of Devil's Crush. I'll save that video for later. Today, I'm going to do something that I think needs to be done by comparing the original Devil's Crush from Naxat Soft to the Sega Genesis version that was ported over by Tengen, and see which version comes out on top. I'll be comparing these games on 4 different categories: graphics and presentation, which is just the visual and aesthetic elements; sound and music, pretty self-explanatory; gameplay, also self-explanatory; and general effect, a category that I learned from my days in marching band that I'll use here as a bit of a wildcard category to sum up the general feel and tone of the game. Let's start with the most obvious one: graphics and presentation. Interestingly, there are more differences between these two versions here than perhaps in any other area. First, we'll start off with small things. While the Japanese versions have all the game's intended flagrant satanic imagery in place, this element was toned down in both versions of the game for the West, most notably with the game's many pentagrams. Both games censor the pentagrams for the West, but they do it in different ways. Dragon's Fury on the Genesis keeps the 5 points of the stars, but removes the somewhat more demonic wireframe look. So they're just solid stars, like the ones you would have glued to your bedroom ceiling when you were 5. Alternatively, Devil's Crush on the Turbo keeps the wireframe look of the pentagrams, but adds extra points to them, so they're not technically pentagrams anymore. You'll see hexagrams here, and the big pentagram at the top of the board is an octagram. There's 8 points. I find both forms of censorship kind of dumb, especially looking back on it today, but I think Devil's Crush on the Turbo retains a shred more of that demonic feel, with the lines crossing over each other, like a traditional pentagram, as opposed to Dragon's Fury where, again, it's just stars that look like they belong on a child's ceiling. Tengen even went through the hassle of censoring their own alternative menu screen for Dragon's Fury by removing this star from the Japanese version, which isn't even a pentagram to begin with, and just turned it into a mess of blue spaghetti. They really must not have liked lines crossing over each other at Tengen. Seriously, what's the point of making a brand new menu screen with an already non-pentagram star if you're just gonna change it again for the West? Just do the pentagrams or don't. Leave the Star of David out of this. It's been through enough. The pentagrams are just the beginning though. Dragon's Fury also has some fundamental differences with the overall art style of the game that change the visual tone quite a bit. As you can see, the main board on the Genesis version is much brighter and more colorful. On paper, that makes sense, as they probably wanted to show off the superior color palette of the Genesis. Although I think ultimately it muddies up the look of the game too much and sort of misses the point. It's kinda like when they went back into the original Star Wars movies and added a bunch of CG crap to them. Can you do it? Yes, but it's also completely unnecessary and kind of distracting. It's definitely interesting to see the game jazzed up like this, but after playing it for a while, you might notice that it's a bit much. The colors are overly saturated, and it can make keeping track of the ball a little bit more difficult than I think it was intended to be. This is far worse in most of the bonus levels, which have unfortunately been completely redesigned in this version. I respect the amount of work that went into them, but what was wrong with the originals? Despite how the newer bonus stages definitely show off the technical superiority of the Genesis, I much prefer the simpler, cleaner look of the original versions on the Turbo, much like with the main board. I mean, look at this bonus stage. It's creepy, it's weird, it makes me feel like I'm not really supposed to be here, and instills a sense of dread and unease. Isn't this way better and more consistent with the visual tone of the main board than this? This might be more visually dazzling in a technical, superficial sense, but it's also kind of a mess and seems to totally miss the spooky, ominous vibe that the original established so effectively. That said, Tengen did add a menu with additional information that's easy to glance at on the right, and they did pump more frames of animation into many of the game's moving parts for Dragon's Fury. When you lose a ball, this guy laughs at you. It looks a lot better on Fury than it does on Crush because of the extra animation. Plus, all of the spinning and pulsating objects throughout the board have many more frames, making their movement look a lot smoother, and I definitely appreciate that. I feel like if they had just stuck with these sorts of things and kept the crazy color saturation in check, and had just left the bonus stages the hell alone, we'd be talking about the superior visuals of the Genesis version. But as it is, I'll happily take the older version, without the enhancements, for its more cohesive, ominous art style. Interestingly, the cover art of both games seems to tell the exact opposite story. While the Genesis cover sells the mood and tone of the game well, the Turbo cover looks a lot more saturated and cartoony, which is odd. Anyway, while I like the more subtle improvements that Tengen made for their version, and those do make this kind of a close call, Devil's Crush on the Turbo ultimately takes the cake in the graphics and presentation department for me for how well it works within the confines of the Turbo and sticks to its own vision. Gameplay. This is a category with somewhat less to talk about since they play basically the same. If there are any differences in the ball physics or the power of the flippers, I can't really notice it enough to factor it in. I will say that I like the additional info on the right of the screen in Dragon's Fury though. It's easy to glance at during play. I also appreciate that the Genesis version has button layout options and 2 settings for the tilt mode, where Devil's Crush on the Turbo doesn't have any of that. The controls are what they are, and the tilt is what it is. Tengen also added in a music test and sound test, which doesn't technically add much to the gameplay, but it does make the game feel like a fuller experience, something that you would expect from a 16-bit game like this. While I don't really like the bonus stages of Dragon Fury as much as the original games for aesthetic reasons, I will admit they're about as fun to play, except this one where you can't see anything. But that is a small gripe when compared to all the quality of life stuff that Tengen did add into their version. So, given that Dragon's Fury is a later version and had the luxury of hindsight and extra time to add in those features, and the basic feel of both games being essentially identical, I guess I have to give overall gameplay to Dragon's Fury by a slight margin. It keeps almost all of what I like about Devil's Crush's gameplay, but adds just enough bells and whistles to make it feel like a more complete game, and give the player a little more agency over how they want to play it. Sound and music. Much like with the graphics, here again we see an attempt on Tengen's part to show off the technical superiority of the Genesis with a wider variety of sounds, a deeper low end, and some nice effects that the TurboGrafx simply wasn't capable of. And it works out pretty well given the expanded frequency range of the Genesis sound chip. There were a lot of ports of games from older systems to the Genesis where the music was not handled very well, and they ended up sounding kind of bad, but this isn't one of them. The darker, brash nature of the music for this game is right at home on the Genesis, and I think Dragon's Fury delivers an interesting take on the tunes overall. There are a couple of additional songs here too that I don't think were in the original, and while they might not be as remarkable as the songs on the OG soundtrack, they do fit well enough. My main complaint here is with the mixing itself. It seems like the balance between the middle voices and the melodies isn't as dynamic on the Genesis version across the board, meaning the volume of the melodies are often matched or even overpowered by some other parts, making them all kind of blurred together at times, without enough separation to let the different voices differentiate from each other. If you don't already know the tunes from the original version and know what to listen for, you might miss some of the better moments from the music in this version when all of the different parts are cranked up to 10. It could be an unintentional byproduct of the instruments that were chosen to replace those from the Turbo, but if that's so, then the dynamics of those voices should have been modulated appropriately. As it stands, while the music is still the same excellent music, it often sounds better on the Turbo due to the more deliberate mixing that lets melodies, middle voices, bass lines, and percussion parts stand out when necessary and get the hell out of the way when needed as well. I also don't really like how the music stops when you lose a ball in Dragon's Fury. Devil's Crush just keeps it going. I mean, why would you stop this song, ever? As far as sound effects go, they are almost entirely the same on both systems, with some subtle differences here and there. The differences are largely dependent on taste, but I find the Genesis sounds to be a little more muffled and dull overall. Like they just took some of the sounds from the Turbo but played them from under a blanket. It's a subtle difference that you probably won't even notice unless you're comparing them side by side, but it is there. So, for all of that, I think the Turbo is the clear winner in the audio department. Again, despite the superiority of the Genesis on paper. As far as the general effect of both games goes, I think both do a good job of being an extremely fun and unique pinball game that gets people like me that don't even really care that much about pinball to absolutely fall in love with it. Like I said, I tend to not gravitate towards this genre, yet this is one of my favorite games of all time, so that says something, I think. The game grabs my attention with the awesome aesthetic it brings to the genre, but it keeps me playing with solid gameplay and some of the best music you'll ever hear from this era. The Genesis version has music and sound tests, tilt modes, and control options, making it feel like a fuller experience than the Turbo version. But the original Turbo version has better audio and visuals overall that I think fit better with what the game is trying to do than Dragon's Fury does. Obviously, I am biased as hell, and this isn't meant to be taken all that seriously, and it's just for fun. So if you're a fan of either version, or you're trying to decide which one to get, I don't think you can really go wrong in either direction. Get whatever one you think looks like it'll appeal to you the most. Or, ideally, just get both, because you really can't have too much of this game. There's no such thing as too much Devil's Crush. That said, Devil's Crush on the Turbo, for me, is the ultimate way to play the game. Except for perhaps the PC Engine Japanese version that has all the satanic imagery intact. This video was something a little different, so let me know what you think of it. I have plenty of ideas for different head-to-heads like this, so if you enjoyed it, let me know, and maybe I'll start doing more of them. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.